Let me get my screen sharing set up here. Portion of screen, that's the thing I want. All right, that looks about right.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. So I'm Martin McClure. Yes, do interrupt me with questions if you have them throughout. Don't wait till the end. I don't have the chat visible right now. So if it comes up on chat, please, one of the hosts, go ahead and let me know via audio.
I have a very short question. Is it still true that GemTalk is part of VMware?
No, we are independent now, have been for coming on 9 years now. So this is the 5th company to be the producers of GemStone. The original company, then we got bought, then we got sold, then we got bought, then we got sold. I've worked for all 5 companies, as have many of the rest of the team. Team has pretty much stayed together through all of that. I would also like to invite some of you to leave your cameras on if you feel comfortable doing so that I don't feel like I'm just sitting here talking to myself. Okay, so we have, try to have everything in the right place here. All right, so we're talking about Sparkle today, and Sparkle is a new integrated development environment for GemStone Smalltalk, which uses Pharo as the graphical user interface. Sparkle is very much at this point a work in progress, and but it has debugging tools that are usable today. We'll take a look at what it looks like today and talk about what comes for the future. So one question that might come up is, why did we call it Sparkle? So the official title is Pharo IDE for GemStone. That's a bit of a mouthful to say when you have to say it a bunch of times in the same day, and it doesn't lend itself very well to shall we say, an attractive acronym. So why Sparkle? Sparkle's the code name. Well, there is this My Little Pony who actually has nothing to do with this project. With this project, it's more like this. Pharo means lighthouse, and so we have a Pharo lighthouse. And what happens when a lighthouse interacts with a gemstone? You get sparkle. So that's where the name comes from. And then the question becomes, well, why do you need a new integrated development environment? To understand that, you need to know a little bit more about GemStone. I know a lot of you know quite a bit about GemStone. There may be some people out there who know less. So we're going to do the very, very quick introduction to GemStone. GemStone is, we talked about those 5 companies. The first of them was founded 40 years ago next month. So we're about to celebrate a big birthday. Happy birthday, GemStone. We still have a couple of those original engineers that were around in 1982 working with us. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what GemStone is and give the very short, completely inadequate one-slide explanation of it. So originally it was marketed as an object database that kind of, well, it uses Smalltalk and it runs Smalltalk, in the database. And as time has gone on, it has come more to be an application server, ways of running Smalltalk that happens to have a built-in object database. And that's more the way I think of it these days. And And as I said, the one slide, completely inadequate explanation of how that works. So it's server-side Smalltalk.
Martin, could you
Yes.
answer one question which bugs me quite a while? The beginning of GemStone must have been PostScript, I'm sure, because all the dictionaries and stack stuff, it is all PostScript. Why? I don't know. I never saw that mentioned anywhere, but it's so obvious that I wonder how that came.
That's a really interesting question.
Probably because
I
PostScript started at the same Xerox as Smalltalk did. Same developers.
Yeah. No, and it's a valid implementation for Smalltalk, no problem. And yeah, but it's interesting to have this stack machine underneath. It's cool.
Yeah, well, I wasn't around when those early design decisions were being made, and I'm not sure where they came from. That's a really interesting observation that it's similar to PostScript, and which it is.
Yeah.
PostScript came from Forth,
Yeah.
and I was a Forth programmer before I became a Smalltalk programmer.
Yes, I did Forth too. Yes.
Yeah. Image-based, completely typeless, non-object-oriented programming. Yeah, interesting stuff. But and a number of small talkers, especially early small talkers, were Forth people before that. I know Dave Thomas was. So, but I know that some of the people, that most of the founding engineers for GemStone came from Tektronix, who had been one of the early testers of the Smalltalk IDE version 1 image and the virtual machine specification. So the Smalltalk definitely came from there.
Right.
Where the PostScript influence came from, I don't know.
Yeah, interesting.
But yeah, so.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, Smalltalk server, because it has a built-in database, it's basically a great big shared image, which can be larger than your memory. So we've had customers using, images of up to, I think, somewhere in the 8 terabyte range at least. You can have thousands of virtual machines running on hundreds of hosts at the same time, all using the same image. And that's not just read only. You can write to that image, and they're shared through transactions. When you commit, it basically merges your changes to objects. This is a bit like something like Git would merge changes to source code. It merges your changes to the objects. You can have, just like with Git, you can have conflicts if you try modifying the same thing, and you have to deal with that in your application. Persistence is by reachability, as in Smalltalk normally. Existence is by reachability. So there is no explicit save operation, and there's definitely no delete operation in the database. The database is garbage collected. So in order to make something persistent, you simply make it referenced from an object that's already persistent, and there is a persistent root object somewhere, and everything that is reachable from there becomes persistent when you commit. And it has no native graphical user interface. It's server only. So the server itself doesn't really have any way to interact with it except through libraries. So if there's no native GUI, how do you develop for it? So we'll take a look at what development environments there have been for GemStone and what there are today. We have Topaz, which is native to GemStone itself, and it's a command line environment. So you can write scripts in it, and you can develop code that way. There's a Topaz debugger, but it's all command line. So it's a lot like writing shell scripts and using GDB for debugging in other languages. For graphical development environments, the classic one is GemBuilder for Smalltalk, or GBS, which is currently available for VisualWorks and VA. Once upon a time, it was available for Visual Smalltalk as well. And and that, you know, gives you a graphical environment. That's been around since the very first version of GemStone in 1986. More recently, we've had Jade, which is in Dolphin Smalltalk, which uses Metacello for package management. We have Toad, which is Dale's the object-centric development environment, which is implemented in Pharaoh 3 and uses Metacello for its package management. And it's also part of the GS Dev Kit Home, which is a package for being able to manage GemStone databases and development environments, which is good for beginning developers to use especially. And more recently, we have Jadeite, which is derived from Jade, also on Dolphin, and it is using the Rowan package manager, which is currently in sort of beta stage. There are some people using it in production, early versions, but the final version is not out yet. Rowan's a good choice for, and so Jadeite itself is also in beta. Rowan's a good, and Jadeite are a reasonable choice for people starting possibly new projects, even though it's in beta. You know, talk to us if you're in that kind of a position. So why do we want, with these options, why do we want a new environment? Well, we had quite a few people that were interested in using Pharaoh with GemStone in one way or another. And we are driven by customer demand. We don't, you know, try to steer people to what their choices are for what Smalltalks to use or what other environments to use, and what parts of their system to put together outside of the GemStone part. So we had a specific request from a customer that said, we need debugging tools for Pharaoh 9. And that plus the other requests we'd been getting for Pharaoh tools of some kind made us move down this road to Sparkle. So how do we want to do that if we're going to do it? We could port one of our existing development environments to Pharaoh 9. You know, we heard the words GBS for Pharaoh quite a bit. But that's actually still quite a bit of work to do that porting. So if we're going to do the work anyway, it seemed like that maybe we would want to make some improvements along the way. But then, of course, you have to decide what it is you're going to improve. And I immediately had a bunch of ideas for things, you know, that had been kind of piling up in my head over the years of what needed improving. And in looking back on it, I realized that they all fell into one category: things that are annoying. So, and that makes sense when you're you know, doing something that's been done before. The things you want to improve are the things that annoy you about the things that were already there. Can almost call it annoyance-driven design. That's in quotes because I don't take it incredibly seriously. And I'm certainly not going to promote it as a universal design methodology. But, you know, in this kind of a situation, it does have a little bit of value. So let's start with some of the internal changes we're making that aren't very user visible, and then work our way up to the user interface design, which is more what I think of as the heart of this presentation. So the GemStone C interface, this is how you what we provide for talking to the GemStone Smalltalk. It's used by all the development environments. It's a library that you can make calls into, shared library that you can make calls into, that will then execute Smalltalk code or do a variety of other things. But that's, you know, that's how you get Smalltalk code started. So you can make a call that will send a message and then you'll get an answer back eventually, or you will make a call that compiles and executes a string and get an answer back eventually. And so some of the annoyances with this thing that we've run into are, first of all, it's a shared library, which means that you have to install a shared library on your client machine. This is not an incredible pain, but it is something that people notice that you have to do, and we have had people request that we see if we can get away without that. A slightly worse problem is that there's a different library version for every GemStone version. So if you work with multiple GemStone server versions concurrently, then you've got to have multiple libraries. And in some of the Smalltalks that we've done clients for, there are limitations on the FFI, that the FFI doesn't play well if you try to load multiple libraries that have the same symbols in them. You can't specify necessarily which library you're trying to call into at a particular time. So talking to more than one GemStone version at the same time, in some cases you have to actually quit your Smalltalk VM and start it up again and load a different library in order to switch versions, which is a pain if you're working with more than one version. But the biggest problem with the GCI, the one that surprises our customers the most, is the one where if you make a call in and it executes some Smalltalk code and then it returns, when it returns, Smalltalk execution stops. So yeah, you can call in and you can fork another thread. I'm going to use the word thread for the class process. So you can fork a thread and yeah, you get another thread running, but then as soon as the main thread returns to the GCI, then all execution stops. And now if you make another GCI call in and start in, then that other thread can also continue to run, but it stops the whole VM whenever you return from GCI. This makes it difficult to have development tools that are using the GCI, because in order to, you basically are either running in your GUI environment or you're running Smalltalk in the server, and you're never doing both at the same time. So you do something in your client environment, you save a method, or you do a single step or something, and then that runs some Smalltalk code in the server, and then it returns and things stop. So developing and debugging in a live environment where you might have like a web server running in the server is not really very practical in that kind of environment, because you can't leave that environment running while you're debugging. The whole thing stops, which is obviously a problem. So for Sparkle, we are going with a different architecture, which is called remote service replication, or RSR. And RSR doesn't use a client library. Eventually, right now it's using the client library for authentication. We're hoping to get rid of that at some point. But it uses a socket connection from the client Smalltalk to the server virtual machine, and so then the GemStone Smalltalk can run continuously, and background processes and various other things, and you can service requests and everything, and you can just be like debugging the one thing you want to debug, or you can examine and modify code while the system's live if you need to, and that sort of thing. So let's take a look a little bit at what RSR actually does. Well, that was this question that I put in that I forgot about. The why not full GBS? Well, let's see, why did I? RSR, am I missing a slide? I don't know. The RSR replicates limited replication of objects across, and you can send messages across the wire. But it is not as general purpose as GBS. GBS does replication of arbitrary objects. RSR does limited replication. We'll be looking at the details of that here in a minute. And why not full GBS replication? It's GBS uses, besides using GCI, GBS is complex. It's like about 100,000 lines of code plus another 120,000 lines of code of tests. It was designed 30 years ago to support client-server applications with a Smalltalk client, sort of a fat client architecture, and it was intended to be transparent. Proxies and replicated objects were supposed to make things just work. Now, by the late 90s, the industry as a whole had figured out that this transparent approach wasn't really practical. It can be correct, but it can't be performant. You have to, in the design, you have to pay attention to the which operations use the network, because there's always that network latency in there. Now, customers are using GBS, and as long as they keep those things in mind, they're very successful. But some customers have been migrating away from the fat client model and to things like especially web clients. And new projects starting up with using GemStone have pretty much not been using the model that GBS was designed for. And in GBS, you get a lot of complexity that comes from trying to be very general, which is harder to implement and it's harder to use, and it's not necessary for a lot of applications. So we wanted to go with something a little simpler right now. Now, if there's enough customer demand for the GBS client server model in Pharo, we might yet support it someday. But we wanted to start with something simpler and maybe better. So let's take a look at how you actually use RSR. Now, RSR was written by Kurt Kilpala on our team. Kurt, if you're there, and I can't see all the faces, so I don't know if you're there. If you're there, say hi, please. Okay, hi Kurt. So how does RSR work? I'm just going to go through the basic typical model, but there's not a whole lot more to it. Typically, you have you build service objects to provide remote services, is the idea. And all these service objects have to subclass from RSR service. And so typically you have a subclass that you give a name. In this case, it's my service. And you then subclass from that a client and a server subclass. Now here, client and server don't really have a lot of distinction between them. They're very nearly peers. Each can send messages to the other and so on. But it comes into distributed garbage collection, that existence of a client will keep a server alive, whereas existence of a server will not keep a client alive. So here we have, we've declared some instance variables in the common template class, and we've declared some instance variables P and Q in the client and server classes. The instance variables that are in the common superclass, those are the instance variables that will be replicated. The instance variables that are in the client and server subclasses are not replicated. This is the primary reason for having the client and server subclasses, is so that you can have private state and private behavior that is not shared on both sides of the link. It may be clearer what I'm talking about if I give you a little bit of sample code for how you would actually use something. So the way that you send a remote message is you send a message to remote self, and I clicked and I shouldn't have clicked because it's a presentation. So you send a message to remote self, which is an instance variable declared up here in RSR service, and this is a forwarder to send a message to the other side. So we send a message to remote self to do something with some arguments, and at that point, the receiver of the message and the argument of the message and any of those shared instance variables are replicated to the other side. If they're already there, then their state is updated. The objects that can be replicated are the service objects. They are kept tracked by identity so that they can be just updated and stay the identical object as you replicate them again. Other objects that are more of the kind of data objects that are not subclassed from RSR service can also be replicated. Well, that can be copied basically across. Things like numbers, strings, byte arrays, sets, dictionaries, not a whole lot, dates, I think, not a whole lot more than that. Any other objects you can't replicate, because we're not going to get into all of the complicated stuff with class mapping of arbitrary objects, which is one of the really more complicated things about GBS. And message sending across the link is done via a custom binary protocol, an RSR specific binary protocol. It's asynchronous, so that when you send a message, what you get back is you get a promise. So typically you would get the promise, and then you would send the promise a when catch with a pair of blocks. One is if everything goes well and you get the answer to your promise, then you can do something with the answer you get back, which is and that answer is also can be a service or can be one of those data objects, and you can get back the whole transitive closure of whatever is being returned, and also the original receiver of the message is also updated when that happens. The catch block is evaluated if you get some kind of error, something that breaks the promise, which can be the connection going down or just an error is being sent, and you get a reason object for that gives you some information about why things failed. So that is the very short way of how you would use remote service replication. This is also available for use by things other than Sparkle. It's an open source project on its own. Sparkle is also open source, MIT licensed. They're out on GitHub. Talk more about that a little later. So how does Sparkle use RSR? Well, Sparkle is a sort of a 3-layer cake. It tries to do a pretty strict encapsulation. Each layer can only know about the layer directly below it. So we have 3 layers. There's the presentation layer. This runs in Pharaoh 9. It's using Spec2 and Morphic. You'll see that more when I get to the demo later. Spec2 and Morphic that have been extended a fair amount, because I found that I couldn't do everything I wanted to do in Spec2, especially as it existed while Pharaoh 9 was still under development, because we started this project nearly a year, I think, before Pharaoh 9 was released. So we were working with some changes going on underneath us. So that the presentation layer talks to the services layer. The services layer is RSR services, and they are split across the Pharaoh 9 and the GemStone server, but they're considered a single layer in the architecture because the objects are replicated. And then that talks to the tools layer. And the tools layer is sort of what you might consider the application model in some other layering schemes. And the tools layer is the interface to the domain objects. And the domain objects are the underlying standard GemStone 64 stuff, processes, objects that you're inspecting, that kind of thing for development tools. So the tools don't do a whole lot of caching. There's a lot of caching going on in the services because they have to they have to send information across the wire. So that's in their instance variables. And as you can see, we talk to the layer below us with message sends, and we announce things using announcements to the layer above us, so that each layer cannot know anything about the layer above it other than, oh, I send these announcements and somebody might have subscribed to them. So a typical thing that might happen is that the tools layer might say to the services layer, hey, something's changed. And then the services layer can go around and say, well, okay, what's your values for these things? Like, what's your stack look like? Or what's your description for your third instance variable, and that sort of thing. And it can compare that with what it's got cached, and then it can say, oh, okay, that value is the same or that value is different, and then it can know what announcements to send to the presentation layer about what needs to be updated. We also, besides writing Sparkle itself, these 3 layers, we also have done domain layer work. We needed server support for this kind of a debugging architecture because all the debugging before has been done through the GCI. It typically hasn't been done in a multi a multi-threading model where, you know, you've got processes that are actually continuing to run while you're debugging and that sort of thing. There's so some changes needed to be made down in the underlying layers to support that. Dale did some work early on, just kind of driving a spike through the problem of trying out some of the things that might be more of the harder problems and verifying that they could at least basically work. That was great. It really reduced the risk of the project up front and provided a base of code that I could template off of as I worked on the more you know, the more RSR specific and Sparkle specific tools. Of course, there was the 80-20 rule in effect there, in that the last 20% of getting stuff to work, you know, takes about 80% of the time. And but that's making it, you know, making things really solid is a high priority for me, because, you know, you talk about annoyances. A debugger that works correctly 80% of the time is really annoying. So, you know, you really want things to work. Once you're in a debugging session, you know, having something that just goes haywire in the middle of a debugging session is not a good thing. We've made some changes. There's been a number of changes. We made some changes to the process scheduler, which is now preemptive by priority, which is the Blue Book model. Before that, it was entirely cooperative, even between different priorities. So that was a problem for us. We couldn't really work with RSR working that way, or it would have been much harder. Now we do, because of these changes to the underlying Smalltalk, it does require GemStone 3.7, which is still in development. That's both RSR and Sparkle do require GemStone 3.7. It is 3.7 is a we're kind of in a private beta stage for that right now. We've given alpha or beta versions to a couple of people, and you know, a couple more people that are motivated to try things out, you know, would probably be accepted. So if you're really enthusiastic, yeah, please ask. So that's kind of the underlying stuff. Let's move on to the user interface. So what we've done before with user interfaces, GBS and Jade and Jadeite, they all look like and generally subclass from the development tools of the host Smalltalk. And in GBS, we found a lot of problems over the years with this approach of doing it. For one, those tools are not really designed for a distributed environment. They don't really have, you know, they make assumptions about things being local. They also tend to make a lot of assumptions about the internal structure of things like classes and methods and processes. And adapting those through subclassing to be usable in a distributed environment and with GemStone Smalltalk, which is not the Smalltalk they were originally written for, is, you know, it was pretty difficult. So a number of years ago, I vowed to never do that again and to do something new. So in designing Sparkle's UI, we're going to be trying to do something new. And in order to do that, I had to learn a lot, and I'm drawing on my experiences with various programming interfaces. So let's take a look at some of the programming interfaces that I've used in the past and what I find annoying about them. Sparkle's design so far is based primarily on things that I find annoying. I'm also interested in what you all find annoying or wonderful as well. So I would encourage you to go ahead and keep notes as you think of things that annoy you about user interfaces, and you know, through the rest of this talk, and you know, and then at the end, I'm going to try to collect from you some of your annoyances, or you can email them to me later. So my first programming interface that I ever used was this. this is an IBM Model 29 key punch. It had some advantages. You could actually write programs on it. It has a very effective and relatively easy to understand physical metaphor that isn't really a metaphor because it really is physical because everything's on cards. The file system is physical, it's wherever you store your card decks. It's very easy to change a single program line. You just take the card out, replace it with a different card, and it's very easy to reorder the program lines. You just pull cards out of your deck and put them back in at a different place. But it had a bunch of annoyances as well. The IBM Model 29 only has a left shift key. Well, it has a right shift key, but it does something entirely different. And in most use for programming, you wouldn't use it at all. It has no undo. It doesn't really have a backspace. I mean, it has this button here, not on the keyboard, but a button there that's called backspace, and it does move the card backwards, but it certainly doesn't unpunch the holes in the card because every time you hit a key, it would punch holes in the card. So, so you kind of, if you made a mistake, you kind of had to duplicate a card and up to that point, and then keep going from there. Debugging was batch mode, which wasn't great. And it's also a little too easy to reorder your program lines. If the rubber band that holds your card deck together breaks and you drop it and it's all over the floor, have fun figuring out what order your program was in. So it wasn't too long before I moved on to my next programming interface, which was this thing. The university had a whole bunch of these. Despite the fact that it says intelligent in giant letters, this was what was usually called a dumb terminal. It's intelligent in this case because it has a built-in microprocessor, which I think actually did let it be programmed to respond to the different control character sequences from different manufacturers. It also claims to be low cost. That is relative. I think that's low cost compared to a teletype. And the teletypes in today's dollars were about $5,000. So this was probably still several $1,000s in today's money. Used this thing mostly with time-shared basic. So that's my introduction to programming as text files, not as card decks. Now, it did have some advantages. It had left and right shift keys. Not that I used the right shift key. It took me years to break the habit of only using the left shift key, which shows how those early experiences can really influence you. Still no undo. Did have backspace, but no undo. And you could do interactive debugging on it, but it was hard to reorder the program lines because the program lines in BASIC were numbered. But while I was using these interfaces, I was reading about much better ones that I couldn't get at my university. I ran across this article that was published in the March 77 issue of Computer called Personal Dynamic Media, where Alan Kay and Adele Goldberg wrote about what they were doing at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. And if I can find the right window, it's here somewhere, there it is. And they talked about all this interesting stuff they were doing, and the Alto and Smalltalk in the classroom, and they tie in all these graphics that they were doing. And here's some Smalltalk code that doesn't look very familiar. I think it may be Smalltalk 72, possibly 76 code. And they were doing music, and they were doing, and a 15-year-old wrote an electronic schematic editor program. And they talk about, oh, we can do all of this in the Smalltalk language, and they don't talk about what the Smalltalk language is. That was very frustrating. But I did notice in the references that they had a reference to the Smalltalk 72 instruction manual. So several months later, having been unable to find any other information about Smalltalk, I got up my nerve and called the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center Technical Publications Department and attempted to order a copy of the Smalltalk 72 instruction manual. I ended up talking to Adele on the phone, and she said that Alan had withdrawn that from publication because it was so out of date compared to what they were doing in 1977. And I said, well, do you have anything about Smalltalk, anything at all? And she said, well, no, but we're working on it. So the 5 more years, finally comes the blue book, and then the green book, and then the orange book, and then the red book, which, no, the red book didn't come. The red book was never actually published. It was supposed to be about model view controller and how you used it. It would have been very useful to know that, but apparently they decided not to actually publish it because they thought that model view controller was a flawed architecture. And but nevertheless, the Smalltalk that they left us with used model view controller. So I took a long time to learn what would have been in that book. But eventually, through all of that and memorizing those books and waiting until I could get a running copy, there came Apple Programmer Development Association Smalltalk in 1985 at a price I could afford, which is $50. And so I ended up running this. Okay, so we're going to launch Apple Smalltalk IDE here. Take a moment. There we go, on the beautiful 512 by 342 Macintosh screen. And so, this came on, I think, 7 floppy disks. Much changing of floppies was done. You'd read the virtual machine off of one floppy, and then it would eject, and then you'd put in the image, and then it would read the image, and then that would eject, and then you could put in the disk that contained your changes file, and then you could leave that in there while you developed code. And then if you needed to save the image, you had, of course, to put back in your image floppy, because floppies were only 400K. So there's some interesting stuff here about this interface. This interface, I'm not going to go through the advantages of this interface because it is so much better than anything I had ever used before that it would take forever to list all of the advantages, but I am going to try to go over what some of the annoyances are. But let's take a quick look here. So we've got a system browser, and I should be able to open that guy. Yeah, there we go. We got those lovely flop out scroll bars. We have, they're a little wider than usual in the Apple Smalltalk. I'm going to make this browser just a little bigger. Still leaving room for the scroll bars on the left. These are a little wider than the standard Smalltalk 80 ones because there's, the Mac had a 1-button mouse and Smalltalk was written for 3-button mice. So there's a little extra column in the scroll bar for the menu. So this is what the yellow button menu would normally be. And you can browse stuff. This is really a lot of the development environments that are used in Smalltalk today don't look a lot different than this. There have been a lot of little improvements, but it's still the same basic idea. So a lot of these annoyances that I'm going to list are things that were only really seen in retrospect. One that did annoy me at the time I was using it is that you end up with way too many windows because you've got, each browser, you can only see one method at a time in each browser, and each inspector, you would only inspect one object at a time, and to inspect an object that object referred to, you'd open a second inspector, and so on and so forth. So that one I noticed at the time. I quickly adopted a style of working where I always had 3 browsers open, one for the code I was writing, one to refer to code I'd written before in the same project, and a third one to look at system code that I was trying to use. So that, and that kind of worked, but it wasn't completely ideal. Some of the things I see in retrospect was that there was undo, but it was only for text. There are a lot of things that ask for your confirmation. If I try to, I know I don't want to delete dictionary do I? There are probably some things I'm in the wrong place if I want to be deleting things, but it'll ask me anyway, right? Or maybe I'll just crash it. We'll find, oops, I can't use a left or right click. I have to use the menu over here. Okay, whoops. I'm framing something. What am I doing? Oh, I'm browsing that. Okay, let's close him. I must have missed my, let's remove it. Oh, there we go. Are you certain you want to remove this method? Okay, I'm not going to remove it. When I was playing with this earlier, even if I said I did want to remove a method that I'd added, it wouldn't remove it. And I don't think that bug was in the actual original Smalltalk because I was able to use that. But it asked for confirmation. And, and that's an annoyance because what I've come to realize is that things that ask for confirmation are missed opportunities to make things undoable. It should be easy to remove a method, but you should be able to undo that. And it should be easy to accept a method, and it should be easy to undo that. And it should be easy to, to cancel your updates to a method, and it should be easy to undo that. It's like, oh, I didn't mean to cancel all those edits I just did before I saved them. Well, you should be able to undo that. It would be really nice if you could do that. So there aren't very many visible affordances in this user interface. Here in the browser, you've got your scroll bars. They're visible. You can work with those pretty well. You've got your instance and class buttons, and that's about it. You have everything else is done through menus. Menus were a lot better than what we had before, but it's really nice. And this is something that has evolved through the years of having more little tools available just right there, and you can just click on them without having to pull up a menu first, and without having to pull up menus just to see what options there are available to you. You can't see both the class side methods and the instance side methods at the same time. I find that an annoyance. I find that an annoyance to this day because I cannot count the number of times that I go looking for a method in a browser and I realize eventually that I'm on the wrong side because I've just used a browser that was looking at some other class where I was looking at the class side when I meant to be looking on the instance side of the new one. So it'd be really nice to be able to get rid of that problem. You can't tell when you have unsaved changes. That's one that has been improved in some of the newer environments. And if you undo, like if I type some characters here and then I do an, well, that's not an undo. Let's see. There must be an undo over here. I haven't used this in so long. It's an undo. Yeah, no keyboard shortcuts either, at least not ones that I know about. Now if I click away from that, it's still gonna say if it's okay to cancel the changes because it doesn't know that I undid all those changes. And similarly in the debugger, you can only see one context at a time, and that's true of most of the newer debugging environments. All right, so I'm gonna switch away from this tab to let my processor rest. That was using pretty much one full CPU of my 16 virtual CPUs on this machine. And even so, it was a little faster than the 512K Macintosh that I originally ran it on. I do have an SE30 that will run that, and it runs it like lightning fast. So the next environment that I want to show you is one from quite a few years, from about 20 years later. Was written in the late 90s and I was using it in about 2001 2002. Where's my squeak? Here's my squeak. Okay. Well, this is squeak 3.9. Although what I'm going to show you was written for an earlier version of Squeak and then updated. And that's the Whisker browser. This is a thing that is written by Doug Way. And I used it. Let's see, I want to open a Whisker browser. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and make this guy big. All right. I used this for a project that I did, which if you were at OOPSLA conferences in the early 2000s and went to the Squeak Bluff, you might have seen me demonstrate this. This was for a juggling troupe. It was a program that let them juggle images of planets on a giant projection screen by waving their hands around in front of it. It was pretty effective. It used video camera for visual input, and it was a lot of fun, and all done in Smalltalk. So, and I found and I did all of that in this browser, and I found that to be pretty nice. One of the nicer development experiences I've had. So here we've got class categories. Here we can have a class hierarchy. And so let's look at what network, the network kernel, be the socket stream class. So if I select the class, it selects it down in the class hierarchy as well. And we get listing of some of the things in there. We've got, let's look at you have to click right on that thing. Okay. Let's look at a very simple method. Okay, so we get the text of the method. So this looks a lot like a traditional browser so far, except that it puts the text of the method beside instead of underneath the other things that you're selecting. So that makes it more horizontal, which is actually fairly appropriate. The original Smalltalk browser was written on the Alto, I assume, and the Alto had a portrait mode screen, taller than it was wide. Almost all the screens since then have been wider than they are tall by default. And so a wider interface seems like it might be useful. But the really unique thing about this, or the different thing, is that if I click on more than one method, then I see more than one method at the same time. And the other thing is there's class methods. And I can see class methods at the same time as I see instance methods. So there's a couple of my annoyances gone already. I can see more than one thing at once, and I can see class and instance at the same time. Can also look at things like the comment. The class comment can also be seen at the same time. There's, you notice that I haven't touched any of these splitters, but it knows that this is a very short method. Socket is a very short method, so it can allocate it less space. I still have a lot more here, that I want to see maybe, and I'm willing to only see a little bit of the auto flush method at the same time. But but it tries to be smart about how it allocates space, which is a really nice touch. Of course, eventually you run out of space and you have to actually click on something to deselect it. You can also see the instance variables, and you can get the references to those. Those are in a conventional browser. They didn't, Doug didn't write that into the Whisker browser, but it's all there. And when you, and if I select more than one class, then we have multiple classes here as well. So you can also see, this has no methods. That's because it's an error. Let's look at something more interesting. There we go. And here we're using, he's using color coding so you can help tell things apart. It's nice to have some visual way to tell things apart. Also, everything is ordered, right? The connection queue class came in above the socket stream class because it's above in this list where I clicked on it. The methods that if I click on more than one method, they're in the order that they are listed there, and so on. That's a long method. So my usual working strategy with this was to just make it full screen and go with it and get everything I needed all in one browser. But you can, of course, make it smaller. And I don't know. Oh, that's right. You have to do it by the corners in this version. But you can get another Whisker browser up as well if you prefer to. And I like having that flexibility. Okay. And of course, the inspector and the debugger are still conventional ones in this environment. It's the only thing Doug did was the browser. So the next thing I want to show you is Newspeak. I have to find the window for that. There we are. So here we have Newspeak. I'm not a Newspeak user, so those of you who are going to, immediately see that I'm not a Newspeak user. This is not the latest version of Newspeak, I understand. There is, Newspeak now runs in JavaScript or something like that, and this is the sort of the inside of modified Squeak Newspeak, but is the one that is more, that I'm more used to the point that I'm used to anything at all in Newspeak. The reason I want to look at Newspeak is because I had seen some interesting things about the user interface that Vasily Baikov did. He had previously done some good things for the user interface in the tools of VisualWorks, and then moved on to do this Newspeak stuff, and has since moved on to other things. But if we look at their browser, source code, and sort of the projects and the packages, I may not be getting the terminology right, but eventually you come down to classes, and you can, kind of like in Whisker, you can get multiple things stacked vertically, and you do have these methods, and you can see the text, the source code of the methods, and you can open as many as you want, and they get stacked up vertically. And so that's a similar kind of idea. In this implementation, some of the things I like less about this implementation is that everything is stacked up vertically, and you have to kind of go through all the intervening stuff. Whereas with the Whisker browser, you could select just the stuff you wanted, and you didn't even have to see the list of collapsed things in between. That may be a matter of taste. But this becomes, again, very vertical, and a more horizontal thing seems more attractive to me. Some of the things I do like about this are that you have affordances for fairly commonly used things, like like this little speech balloon is for senders and implementers. And so then you get the senders and implementers. He also did sort of a browser-like, web browser-like thing where you have a back button to get where you're going. That's an interesting idea. I'm not quite sure about it myself. But I like the fact that there are lots of affordances for those things. If we then look at the debugger, so if I go to workspaces, there's this little expression that I've put in here, and I can push a button that says evaluate it, and we get a debugger. And so here we have the stack, and same metaphor, we open the stack frames we're interested in looking at. And we can see more than one stack frame at a time. And I really like that idea. And we can, let's step into the block a little bit. I think we should be able to do that. Let's see if that actually works. Where are we? Still in collect. Okay. But, okay, so I'm not sure the exact semantics of this, but the main thing is that you can do stepping at different levels, you know, because if you're looking at more than one frame and you want to step, well, which frame are you stepping relative to? So that makes sense. You know, if I step over here, then I should get out of the whole thing. You've got over here your inspector of what's going on, and you can open and close those. Once again, everything is vertical. If I step over there, sure, yep, it comes out and it's done. And up at the top, we've got ways to continue or terminate the process, to just let it go. And I've got some evaluation results, which should be, I don't know whether that should actually be the result of what I just did or not. It doesn't appear to be. So, so that's the kind of thing I looked at in Newspeak. So now we're moving on to even more recent stuff. Pharaoh 9, say, oh, there it is. So let's open a browser. So there's a lot of really nice things about the Pharaoh browser compared to the Smalltalk IDE browser. You know, we have code highlighting and autocomplete and all sorts of things. We also have the ability to, we have splitters that, you know, let you move to see more or less of particular things. They only move the splitter itself. So if I wanted to see more of this without seeing less of this, I'd have to move two things. That's not great. And, you know, and you can still only see one method at a time, sort of. There's these tabs and they kind of get part of the way there, but not quite all the way there. But you do get good feedback on unsaved methods. If you start to edit a method, then you get this little triangle in the corner that shows you that that what you've done is not saved. And if I undo that, it goes away, which is nice. However, if I backspace over it, it does not go away, which is less than useful. Because sometimes I start typing with the wrong text focus, and my immediate instinct is not to hit undo, but to hit backspace, which may just be my habits, but it would be nice if backspace also worked. The inspector in, what should we inspect? How about we just inspect this array? So the inspector here, this is based on the GT inspector, the Glamorous Toolkit inspector, which was done which was in Pharaoh 8, and they replaced it in Pharaoh 9. They also replaced it with something that doesn't work quite as well. Actually, let's just inspect that instead, because it's a more complicated object. Okay. So this one, you know, when you select something, you get what you clicked on. You get that to the right. You can still only get one at a time, but you can get, you know, you get something to the right. And if I click on something there, then it shifts to the right again. In the Glamorous Toolkit version of this, you could see more. You know, you could work with this thing down below to scroll through or see more. There, Pharaoh 9, it's buggy if you do that. If you use more than 2, then you will generally regret it. So that's not great. Hopefully that's being fixed. Oh yeah, and the really, really annoying thing, I really kind of liked some of the aspects of the GT inspector. You know, going horizontal, that's good. Being able to see multiple levels at once, that's good. It really, really bothered me that I can't move this divider, that all parts of the chain I'm looking at, they're all equal size, no matter what I do. Now, I can look as many as few as I want, but they're all going to be exactly the same size. Okay. So now, on to Sparkle. So in designing Sparkle's UI, I wanted to incorporate some of these ideas, some other ideas, you know, trying to make something that's less annoying, to me anyway, and hopefully eventually to other people as I get more feedback. Now, as you change things, of course, there's the danger of creating new annoyances. There's annoyance just in the fact of being different. Some people don't like any kind of change, and there's always exceptions for that. Those people have their own individual annoyances, and they wouldn't mind if those things change. They just don't want anything else to change. And even for those who accept change more readily, unfamiliarity itself is a bit annoying. So there's really two kinds of annoyance. There's the initial annoyance due to unfamiliarity, and then there's the kinds of annoyances that continue to bother you even after you've been using it a long time. And it's those particular kinds of things that have been bothering me for years that I've been trying to work with here and that I've been talking about in the talk so far. But because of that, this is kind of it needs to be an iterative process with feedback. You know, you need to be able to let people use it for a while, figure out what is still annoying them after they've been using it a while, give you feedback, and, you know, tweak things and repeat the process until you get something that a wider group of people agree is better. So that's kind of the process we're in. Currently, we're not even done with the initial version. It's usable. Not all of the usability features that I want to put in are in yet, but let's take a look at the current state of Sparkle. So here we have a Sparkle connections launcher. And I have one connection profile, which I will select. It shows that it's going to connect to a GemStone that's running on this host that is version 3.7, that has this kind of a name and that kind of a port number or name, and this kind of user and password, and that it's going to get that GCI library I talked about from there. You can also do a direct connection without a GCI library, but that is currently not authenticated. You have to actually set up the server through Topaz to be receptive of that kind of insecure connection. Eventually, we want those to become more secure. And I can connect, and we get a Sparkle Explorer. Now, Explorer is sort of the generic name for these kinds of windows in Sparkle. You know, the debugger comes up in an Explorer. This Explorer happens to contain initially an inspector pane for the object nil. And it contains a single evaluator. Because all a workspace really is an evaluator where self is bound to nil. So since inspectors can all have evaluators where self is bound to the object being inspected, you know, starting off with, you know, it seemed like you didn't really need a separate thing to be a workspace. You could just have an evaluator as part of an inspector. So we could do something here. Let's inspect the object set, which is a class. And we can go here to the hamburger menu. This is one of the things I've been doing as well, is that, I try to have affordances for everything. Menus are all visible. At the moment, there actually aren't even any right-click menus anywhere in Sparkle. I'm not opposed to having those, but I don't want anything to only appear in a right-click menu. I want everything to be, kind of touch-friendly, something that you can see. So I'm going to accept this text. And this is unlike a do it, where a do it is the selected text. In the case of the evaluator, it always evaluates the entire text. But if you want to have like a bunch of little snippets, like you would do perhaps like in this workspace, you can use this add evaluator button. There's another thing, is that pretty much everything has a hover help on it. So if you don't know what it means, you hover over it, you find out. But you can just keep putting those things in, and you can have a different kind of, and I can evaluate object. And now we get, we're inspecting two objects over here, and they're stacked up, just like in the Whisker browser. And the dividers are draggable, and there's an affordance for them. You can see that in the standard Faro tools currently. There aren't, you can hover over them and see that you can move them, but you can't see that without hovering over them. In the older Squeak that we saw with the Whisker browser, there was this affordance that kind of showed you that it was draggable, but you actually had to grab the draggable thing. The ones that I built for this are you can drag them anywhere, even though there's an affordance that shows you can drag it. Hopefully best of both worlds. And as you might expect, you can select any one of these things. So here we can have a method dictionary and so on. And and then there's a timestamp, and you can multi-select there and see both objects there. Now, it's not yet smart about allocating space the way the Whisker browser is. That's something I want to do. These draggable boundaries are a relatively new addition, and so they're a first version. One thing that does change about these is that when you drag one, the others also move. So, if I drag this one, I can squish the things to the left, or I could squish the things to the right. And it doesn't really matter how many of those there are. If we got a bunch of things up here, then, I would be either squishing the three things above or the two things below, depending on what it is. The idea is that when you move something, you're trying to make more room for the thing you're most interested in. I also want to make that a little bit remembered. It's like, oh, they just made that thing bigger, so that's going to be a little stiffer, a little more resistant to being closed when you move something else. One of the things that is not an option yet that should be is the option to take one of these objects that's here in a linked pane, because it's linked from over here. These little green triangles are sort of a universal hint in Sparkle that what you click on will open something in the next column. And then when it's a big one that's solid, then it's like, oh, it's already, there is a linked pane for it, and clicking on it will close that. You should be able to take a linked pane and make it independent and move it around in that window to somewhere else that you would like it to be, or to put it in a new window of its own. And you can't do that yet. That's one of the things that's coming. Also, if you've got enough things, it's kind of like, well, where did all these come from? We don't have the color coding that the Whisker browser had, at least not yet. One idea is that, you know, how these, you can see how these, how you get highlights, little subtle highlighting normally in Pharo as you mouse over a table in Morphic. And it would be nice if as you moused over something that had a linked pane, that pane subtly highlighted at some point to make it easy to find, oh, it's that one. I think that would probably make it more usable. So that's the way that inspectors work and evaluators. And you can start an evaluator anywhere. I'm going to close that, which closes all of its linked panes as well. And let's just kind of close all of these. But if I get an evaluator here with class set, I can evaluate things in its I can do an evaluation in with where self is bound to the to that. Also, we get the you haven't evaluated your changes yet hint, the little thing in the corner. And if I evaluate those, then that goes away. And if I type, it comes back. But if I backspace over it, it goes away. So it's just comparing the original text, the last accepted text, to the text that's currently in there and deciding whether or not to put that triangle there based on that. It was pretty easy to do that. One of the things about this inspector that eliminates one of the big annoyances that I had that wasn't specifically a UI annoyance was that a lot of inspectors in Smalltalk land send messages to objects that they're trying to inspect without knowing what that object is or that it can respond to that message. And there's no real reason to do that. And it's fairly easy to avoid. And when you work with proxy objects and working in RSR and GBS, there's a lot of proxy objects floating around. This gets to be really annoying. So here we have a subclass of nil, which is part of a test. One of the automated test suite does test that you can inspect an instance that understands no objects whatsoever. Doesn't even understand, does not understand. No objects at all. So what happens if we try to inspect that guy? Well, there it is. It has two instance variables. They happen to be nil. And of course, I can't send any messages to it, or it would, or the VM would die, basically. Because that's Smalltalk's standard response to does not understand. Actually, in GemStone, the VM doesn't actually exit. It does throw an error when it does not understand. But so if I can assign to it. Accept that. I don't need the inspector on that. There's a twizzle here that if you don't want all the list of instance variables, you can close that. There's also a twizzle here for the print string. So if you have something with a long print string, you can see the entire print string. Scrolling as necessary. That right now. And I was able to assign to an instance variable in this object that understands nothing. So now if I were to try that in Pharo, I think I'm going to actually not do that, but here I did try that a little while ago, and here's what happened. You get the VM dies. So because their inspector sends messages to the objects. When we were working on RSR, we tried subclassing the RSR forwarder from proto object, which has like 65 methods and is supposed to be enough for tools to use. But even with 65 methods, it wasn't enough. We ended up having to subclass it from object, which has a zillion methods that it understands. So it's not a perfect forwarder by any means, but just trying to debug the thing was just too hard because the debugging tools kept sending messages to the darn objects. That's very annoying. So the other big thing we've got here is we got the ability to debug things. So let's take a simple expression. And let's actually just, well, we can accept it and we get what we expect. We get from 1, 2, 3, if we add 5 to each one, we get 6, 7, 8. Got that. So, but let's debug that. So if we debug that, we get a stack, which only has one thing in it. There's some glue that's being suppressed. That is glue for how to launch how to launch a process through Sparkle and how to get it into the debugger at the top of the stack. But the only really interesting code is the one that's being shown here. We have the ability to terminate the process or to proceed the process. That's kind of similar to what was in Newspeak. If I continue that, I get the same answer I got before. Let's debug it again. And but here we've got our frame, and we can step into, step through, step over, or reset to the beginning of the frame. So let's do some stepping through. We should be able to get into that block. There we go. Now it automatically selects the top frame because it thinks you're going to be interested in that. But it also leaves selected other things that you had selected. So, and like the Newspeak debugger, you do have the choice of stepping in, in whatever frame you want. For instance, if we were to continue doing a step through down here, that actually will stop in the block. So we will see the block up above moving, and then we're in the next execution of the block, and so on. We have local variables shown, that you can show. Here we have, there's a receiver, which is a block. Each is bound to 2, and you can see that here we are about to send the message plus 2 with an argument of 5. And if I do a single step there, then we have a 7 on the stack, where each is still 2, and 7 is going to be the result of this block that is returned. If I step again, now I'm back in collect somewhere. Oh, I didn't mean to get into collect. Well, if I go down here and do a step through, well, okay, now I'm back into my each again. And if I terminate that, it's going to say the process has terminated. That also happens if you terminate it from outside somewhere. You'll see that in a minute. But let's do some stepping into. So we can step into the collect. That's where it would be nice if it were smart about how big to make things. It would have done something like that. But at least I can move it. Step into that. Size was a trivial method that you can't step into. Species for collect, though, we can go into that. We go into that, and so on. So step into and step through, step over all work as hopefully one would expect. We ended up writing some specifications for how those things should behave in some very odd situations involving unwind blocks and who knows what all. Those specifications are available from me upon request because I'm really interested in seeing what comments people have on them. We tried to do the best job we could with what is the most useful answer to some of those. What happens if I try to rewind collect? Yep, it becomes the top frame and it's positioned at the beginning. So pretty much what you'd expect. And the most recently added piece of stuff still in progress is the processes window. And you can get more of those evaluator windows anytime you want. If you say disconnect, all the windows disappear. Here we have what processes are running in the virtual machine of GemStone. We have an evaluation process. And if I click on that, I inspect it. And it's an inspector like any other. These buttons here would open a debugger on the process. That's not working yet. That is in process. I think I have about another few hours work to get that working properly. But here we get the we're inspecting the raw inspector on the process, which I believe is the one that we are debugging. And we can find that out by looking at the print string of that process, which is long, but it should show the full stack. And yes, we have here that we're doing a collect. So that's the same, that's the same stack that we've got here. And you can see here in this view, you can see all of the glue code that we've used to get into that point where we're using an SPK evaluator tool on the tools layer that I talked about before about how to evaluate a method. And then here we're dealing with the breakpoint that it hit, which is a step breakpoint, and how that breakpoint actually gets us into the Sparkle's process manager and into the debugger. And it gets into the process scheduler, which is then switching processes. So you can look at these and you can inspect those at this point. And if you, I'm just really curious about that one because I don't know what it is because it doesn't have a name. It just has an OOP. Oh, of course. Okay, that's our GCI process. Okay, it doesn't have a name, so we didn't give it one. I often develop using the direct connection, and the direct connection ones do have a name. And these three processes are the internal processes of RSR. We have a reader and a writer process that deal with the socket, and a process to do ephemeron mourning because it uses a weak registry to keep track of objects. Okay, so that is pretty much the state of things now. As you can see, we have usable but not ideal debugging tools. Some of the things that are upcoming are inspector views. If you inspect a collection, it would be really nice to get, be able to see not just the raw view, but the the collection view where you see like the elements of the set rather than the internal structure of the set, and be able to choose between those. The hamburger menu is currently just says raw view, and that would become multiple views of that. One of the things that I got from Doru's conference presentations and the Fink guys was the notion that really everything is an inspector, that a browser is just a specialized inspector on code, and a debugger is just a specialized inspector on a process. And so that is something that I'm going to think about more. It's possible that a debugger, as you see here, is really just a view on a process, so that so that this is the raw view of a process here, but this is the debugger view of the process. And you might be able to switch back and forth between those. Certainly we need to have views on inspecting collections. Security needs to be improved. Right now, we're just using a plain old socket. We need to be able to use TLS sockets for security. I've already talked about making the linked panes independent, the smarter splitters, and lots of other user interface stuff. And beyond that, then evolving it into a browser and other development tools. Breakpoint browser is also needed, way to set and delete breakpoints. It will be, when it gets a browser, it will be based on the Rowan package manager, and which stores files in the tunnel format. And that, I think, is pretty much all I had. So time for questions and for what annoyances you have, which I am ready to take notes on.
Thanks, Martin. So if anyone's got any questions, just unmute yourself and ask away. There's been lots of chatter in the chat room, so I'm not sure I can find all the questions. So if someone asks something in the chat room, it might be best if you ask it again. Thank you.
I'll try scrolling through the chat and see what I say, but I'm also listening.
There's not many questions there. Lots of talk, not many questions.
Okay.
Lots of people were inspired by the whole history, and we were talking about when they started doing things and what they recognized.
Yeah, it's such a pretty topic considering it's this year is 50 years since Smalltalk 72, right? So right. We're all in a sort of remembering mood. But question I wanted to ask is, so in order to run this IDE, you need to have an RSR layer on the client, and can that be used to build other applications, for example, GUI applications?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the idea, is that, that's why it's a separate project and a separate set of packages, is that it is, it is designed for building, distributed applications, especially GUI applications.
All right. Thank you. Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if you hear me well. I have very bad connection. I would like to know, I've seen at the beginning you have a graphical only user interface for GemStone. For what reason? What is the benefit of having without graphics, let's say?
What is the benefit of not having graphics? That is an interesting question. We actually did have a graphical user interface for a brief period of time. There were a few years, I think in about 95, the management shut that project down, but there was a native X window interface with a development environment that was native to GemStone, but we were essentially, and still are, partnered with a number of the other Smalltalk vendors, and I think management at that time, and of course the management now is very different than it was back then, but at that time I think the management didn't want us to be perceived as competing with them, and we don't consider ourselves in competition really with other Smalltalk vendors. But mostly it's just that it's a lot of work to do that. It's not like we would never do it, but we typically, a lot of our customers run GemStone on giant server machines or farms of hundreds of server machines, and you know, and they're doing background tasks and stuff, and they're not even supporting any kind of graphical user interface at all, because it was intended to be a server-side Smalltalk.
Yeah, but I mean, in the debugging phase, it becomes much more difficult now if you don't have a graphical user interface. I mean, you have only, I've seen only GNU Smalltalk without a GUI, okay?
Right.
It's more difficult.
Yes. And debugging in Topaz is certainly, you know, it works, but you know, it is, I find the graphical user interface much better. And that's why we've almost always had a graphical user interface through another Smalltalk that uses a, you know, some kind of RPC calls to interact with the server. You know, and Sparkle is the next iteration of that. I certainly wouldn't rule out, you know, there might be a day that we have a native graphical user interface in GemStone, but you know, it's not in our current plan.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
A couple of questions on the debugging side of what you're doing. One of the things I use a lot in the VW debugger is the jump to that skips over the code as a way to get around a problem. Is that in your forecast?
It is in the forecast. It is in the forecast. It is in, I actually have a feature request into our in our system for that, and I think part of it has been implemented of the what is needed for the underlying. But yeah, it's really good to get an actual request for that. It's good to hear from people that actually use that. I've used it a few times in VisualWorks. For those who don't use VisualWorks, jump to, well, some debuggers have, you know, run to cursor, which advances execution to wherever you put the cursor. Jump to actually goes directly to the cursor without executing the intervening code. And which is a really interesting way of doing things. And it's kind of an extension of how you do the rewind to the beginning, but it's a little more difficult. And there have to be some kind of, it's depending on whether or not you put restrictions on it, it's easier or harder to do. In VisualWorks, if I remember correctly, you can only jump to points where the evaluation stack is empty because it doesn't know what to put in it.
Yeah,
and
it also struggles with the inside block simulation areas, like jumping outside of that. It'll say you can't do that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that probably can't go away. My idea for jumping to a place where the evaluation stack wasn't empty was to give you an evaluation stack with nils and let you assign to the evaluation stack in the debugger before you did anything. Like, you know, if you jump to where the next send is a plus, well, then you can, you know, you can put whatever numbers you want on that evaluation stack and then proceed from there. You know, that was kind of my idea. We'll see how it turns out, but yeah, very definitely on the radar.
Okay, and then the second part is debugging within Seaside running on GemStone. How are you seeing that all come together?
I certainly hope that will work. We haven't tried it. That I haven't tried it anyway. I don't know if anybody else in the company has tried it, but you know, given that it is its own, you know, RSR processes listening on their own socket, and that they're not interfering with any other processes that are handling web request, other socket requests and that sort of thing. I would expect that to work and only interfere with Seaside's operation to the point that, you know, you actually, you know, said, hey, halt and debug this Seaside process, and then obviously that one's halted and isn't going to work. But yeah, that's part of the advantage of doing it the RSR way, so that you can debug in a live session, or, you know, once there's code development tools, you'll be able to actually change code while the system's running.
Okay, cool.
Hi, Martin.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Nice talk. My question is if you have thought of any way to communicate two objects that sit in different windows or subpanes inspectors, let's say.
Oh, how to communicate between those. Like,
Yeah.
Oh, like I want to send a message to that object over there. That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about sending a message to it. I had very much thought about being able to assign to that way, where you say, this object that I'm inspecting over here, drag that into this instance variable, right? And to a very specific area. There's a feature that I didn't know about until relatively recently in VisualWorks where you can drag into an inspector and it will do an assignment, but it's kind of, I've heard from users that it's a little too easy to use and they sometimes change objects they didn't mean to change. So this would be a very specific drag into a very specific target spot that would like change its appearance. Maybe a little colon equal icon or something that you do. So
they recently added protected instance variables. So I remember once I accidentally brushed my mouse and the whole VM crashed. I was trying to figure out why. And I basically dragged and dropped an object into some critical instance variable like a process or something that the VM, can't let you just have a random object in.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. That kind of thing. Exactly. I once, probably more than once, but not that many years ago, I had a very puzzling problem for about half an hour until I figured out that I'd accidentally typed capital P, capital letter, whatever the name of the class was, instead of the lowercase same name that I was using as a temporary variable, and I'd assigned to it, and I'd assigned over the class, and that also has similar problems. Okay, so debug C side and.
No, my question about the communication between two objects that are next each other but in different subpanes or windows is sometimes, for instance, I don't know, you want to compare two strings or something like that.
Right.
So you have to assign to a global. It's not nice.
Yeah.
That's what I did a drag and drop object framework once. And so I had, I know it was kind of cool. And the fun part was, this in the way back in the old days, so the Macintosh had just come out with custom icons for the files. So I had a whole large giant group of little icons that I could actually assign to objects, which made it more fun. But I had like a cool thing called a drop comparator. So you'd have like two inspectors. You want to know, are these two objects the same? Just drop the two objects in, and it would, basically show, are they the same? Are they different? And the same thing. Obviously, the poor man way is just dump what you need into a global variable, then it's in scope everywhere.
Right. Yeah, I think that, I have thought a little bit about that, and it's a little harder to figure out exactly how to do it. But I think that if you in an evaluator, if you were to put a some way to type or otherwise insert a placeholder in the expression, and then drag an object into that placeholder, anywhere in Smalltalk where it could be a variable, and then in the background it would like generate a temporary variable name for that, and assign it to that particular object for you, and then when you executed it, it would work. So I think that's doable. It's a little more complicated, but I think it's a good idea. I've put it on my list. Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Martin, there's a couple questions in the chat. The first one is, when and how are Sparkle going to be available?
Oh, yes, of course. So Sparkle is open source. It's on GitHub. It's under development now, active development. As I said before, it requires GemStone 3.7 or later. Given that 3.7's not out yet, the or later doesn't really apply. But if you're one of our customers and really want to try it out, or you're really motivated to want to try it out anyway, you can ask us for a beta of 3.7, and as long as we don't get too many of those requests, we're likely to grant them. So, and when 3.7 is out, which we don't have a schedule for that right now, but I would certainly expect it to be this year, and unlikely, I think, to be towards the end of the year. I'm not going to be more specific than that. Then you certainly would be able to download GemStone and Sparkle and give them a try.
Another question in the chat. Will Sparkle be able to run independent of GemStone?
Independent of GemStone, partially. That is what I actually implemented first. I implemented the inspector, and I implemented it against Pharaoh. So actually, I believe, unless there's been bit rot in that area, because I don't exercise that often, you can do an inspector from Pharaoh to Pharaoh, either within the same image or across from one image to another image. Within Pharaoh. I did not bother writing a debugger for Pharaoh. I didn't write the tools layer for that in Pharaoh. If someone were to write the tools layer in Pharaoh, then it would work. Otherwise, it wouldn't. But yeah, RSR works with Dolphin and with Pharaoh and with GemStone. It's pretty much standard Smalltalk code. Pretty much any Smalltalk that can do sockets and some kind of weakness, ephemerons or weak arrays, can run RSR. And RSR should be easy to port to other Smalltalks if there was interest in doing so.
Cool.
The
RSR
tools.
for mist.
Say again, Mike?
Cool. RSR for mist.
Yes, that's on the roadmap. It's a long ways down the roadmap, but it's, yeah, I am afraid I've had very little time to work on Mist the last few years. So I'm hoping I can get to that before I die. But yeah, no, I think that Sparkle and RSR would be the initial development environment for Mist. Because it makes sense, because then I don't have to implement a GUI in Mist immediately, right? I just have to implement an RSR, which is much, much simpler.
And one additional question, is RSR available somewhere?
Thanks, Kurt. Yes, if you go to github.com/GemTalk, then RSR and Sparkle are repositories that are in there. So if you want to see the current state, RSR is pretty stable right now. It's not, flailing around. If you wanted to try it out, it does require GemStone 3.7 for the GemStone version, but if you wanted to try it out in Pharaoh and or Dolphin, by all means, give it a try and talk to us about it, because we're really interested in hearing how that goes, helping you out with it if you need it, and so on and so forth, because that is there. We don't really regard that as ours. We originated it. We're going to use it. We're going to take it where we need to go with it, but it's also there for the Smalltalk community in general to use.
You squint your eyes enough, it seems sort of like what's going on in the language server protocol world.
Oh, okay. Okay. I haven't been following that, so that's good to know.
You get to use the dev tool at your choice and then connect it up to any language that can be an LSP server.
Okay. Yeah. that makes sense.
Martin, I have also a question. As I understand your working process, RSP would be suitable to debug a process within a GemStone process, GemStone database.
Yes.
And if one would exchange or the socket against the web socket, it would be possible to go via HTTPS into a GemStone server.
That
the idea is that if it would be possible to reach my customer GemStone servers via this way, not via a direct socket, but via HTTPS, via WebSocket, get into this GemStone server and talk to your framework. And the next step would be get a browser and use a browser and then use this tool as to show the information of my running customer service.
Right. That's, I mean, it sounds possible. You know, right now what we've got is based on the idea of a direct socket, which does not, you know, speak HTTPS protocol, but, you know, if you gave it some sort of gateway, you know, if you built a gateway, you or someone, anyone built a gateway that went from an HTTPS WebSocket like to a localhost socket that RSR was listening on, then
there's a shim that does that called WebSocket.
Even if can't you do if you know where you're going to go, you can do an SSH tunnel. If that, I mean,
you could do any of those things. RSR is implemented in a way though that would allow you to switch out a WebSocket as the backend for communication. Since it's bidirectional as well, you get communication both directions like we would hope for.
Right. Yeah. And, and RSR is relatively simple. So it's not that hard to, change, as Kurt said, that layer of what kind of socket it's actually using. It's just that it does use its own protocol. And if you wanted to like wrap that inside of HTTPS, you'd have to do something. But a WebSocket, you should be able to use whatever protocol you want.
Martin. Hi, Martin. Is there a plan for or a timeline for code browsing or code editing tools?
There isn't a timeline at this point. As I said in the talk, the initial request was debugging tools, but as you can see, the debugging tools are getting to a point where they're usable. I do want to do more in the debugging tools before I tackle browsing, but browsing is very definitely something we want to get to. I mean, it's something we need. Currently, you can use Jadeite. We don't want to do that before Rowan is ready for public use, because we do want it to work with Rowan. But that we're getting relatively close to that. I don't know if Dale has any comments on timeline for Rowan.
Does my microphone work?
It does.
Okay. No, I don't have any comments on Rowan's timeline. No, other than we're in the middle of working on V3 of Rowan, and I would say we're 3/4 done. And the difficulty of being, well, I don't consider it done until we do have a Linux version of the IDE as well. So, but with that said, I think we're coming out with an alpha soon that will have Jadeite capabilities plus some scripts that you can run to fill in the blanks. And so, we're getting very close, and that's with V2.2. But, it's a matter of how many hours there are in the day, and where we put our priorities for getting done. But So, the answer is there's no deadline date that we're shooting for right now. We're still allowing ourselves to go until we're finished.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Dale. Yeah, that's a good way of describing it right now. We have had some customers that had very specific needs and very specific deadlines, and of course we do everything we can to get them and have gotten them what they need. And that means giving them some fairly rough stuff sometimes, and then smoothing it out later. This one, I'm putting a real priority on making the debugging tools very, very solid. I don't really want to be able to break them, and we've been putting a lot of work into the underlying layers rather than the UI. And I think that the browsing tools and development tools will, in one way, they're more complicated, but in another way, they will be simpler because the underlying infrastructure is already there. So some of each. I wouldn't expect anything of release quality probably, in the next few months, certainly, but for development tools. But yeah, it's something we're going to be working on.
Martin, I guess multiple users can use Sparkle to connect to the same GemStone instance, right? So they can work collaboratively on the code. So this begs me the question: do you have any wishes or thoughts about collaborative features when people work on the same code base?
That's a really interesting question. Thanks, Johan. I'm making a note on that. Yeah, I don't know how well that works right now. I haven't tried it. In theory, it works pretty well. That was part of the design. That's one of the reasons for splitting out the tools layer and the services layer, is that you could have two developers actually sharing the same gem, the same VM, right? That's one level of collaboration. The other level of collaboration is they have separate VMs, but they're working on the same underlying database and therefore working on the same code base. And there you have to deal with collaborative features. And there I think some design work needs to be done. Has to be some thought put into that, and that is thought that I haven't done yet. I know we have people on the team that have had experience with various collaborative environments, and we would want to do some brainstorming for that. If you have ideas for what ought to be, for what things you really like or things that you've found annoying in collaborative experiences, I would love to get an email that details those.
I have to think deeper as well. That it was just something I was thinking about, because right now, if you work together with people who are all working at home, it's more like you're putting up the browser in Zoom, right? And then you start working on each other's screen. And I've been thinking about, it's actually easier we should actually have the same browser on the same Smalltalk instance, right? On the same GemStone. We're seeing it working. So
right.
I guess every interaction you do, it's triggering a transaction right now. So everything you do, if you edit the code, it's a transaction that's put in, or is it something you have to think about right now as a user to commit explicitly?
In Sparkle, of course, there's no code development yet. So commits are there's actually a menu item for committing. So there's no you don't commit unless you say you want to. But since it's mostly inspector debugger and there's no way to edit code yet, then committing is not something you do as often. In Jadeite, you have the option of turning on auto commit, which I do, which is, every time you change something, it commits. And that's, there's a couple of different models for doing that. So we probably would support a couple of different things. If you did have multiple developers sharing the same gem through Sparkle, then that it would be like two different clients and two different connections and sharing the same tool, which is so they have separate services but the same tool. But the tool transmits announcements. So you should just automatically get, both of your environments updating as the tools transmit announcements about changes. So somebody changes something, it changes instantly on the other person's screen. That is something that the architecture makes so that it should basically just work. Haven't tried it yet though, and that's a really should try that before too long.
If you had two people connected to the same gem and you change the code there, it just changes in that gem. It wouldn't actually commit to the permanent repository unless you actually did a GemStone commit. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So it'd be almost like, working off an uncommitted shared file system before you committed traditional code back to the repository.
Right, and that's one of the things I've thought about. I've had some thoughts about. I don't know what direction we'll actually take, but you kind of want, one of the things that GemStone doesn't have is it doesn't have a changes file for developers. It just like you committed this and you're done. Have fun getting the last version back. So having a kind of an intermediate repository that sort of takes the place of the changes file. I've thought about having like a small Git repository that every time you change a method, it actually makes a commit to this little Git repository, and that Git repository is there for your, for your development session, which can be, multiple days, and come back to it as long as you want that Git repository to be around. And then when you actually want to do like a Git commit to your Git repository that stores all of your tunnel files, then, then maybe you throw away all of the little, every single method change is a commit kind of thing that you already did, or something like that. We want to have Git integration anyway, and it seems like you could, leverage that. There are of course other ways of doing it, including the traditional changes file kind of way of doing things.
Well, Jadeite does have a method history that's actually persistent. So
that's right. Jadeite does. Yeah. Yeah, and in Pharo, you have both the local method history and the method history in the Git repository. So you got kind of got two levels of history there, and they're both useful. It's kind of disconcerting to me having them be completely separate, but that's what you get, I guess, right now. So.
Yeah, for me, Miro is a good example of how that actually can work, working with multiple people on the same data. But of course, that is a large canvas where you're drawing on. So that's easier to not be in each other's way. I don't know if you've seen it, but
I haven't seen it.
That really works well. But even there, you have issues with people throwing away stuff that others have been editing.
Yeah. Anytime you get multiple developers working on the same area of code or the same area of data, you've got to have coordination.
So Martin, I have an annoyance with UI. I have a lot of annoyances with UI and browser and everything. So
good.
And I found one which you are not on your annoyance list, I think. I'm really annoyed about the waste of horizontal space. So I observed the first thing you do when you open your own browser is to adjust the vertical bars to make more space horizontally to read the values of all the objects. That should be automatically. So there's so much wasted on the left column, which would give you a lot more space on the right column if you do it like in a responsive way. So that's one thing, and I know it's difficult. I tried myself. It's really not easy because you cannot just bound it to the things you actually see. What are you doing when scrolling? So you widen and shorten. It's difficult. Anyway, there should be something done about that. The second bit related thing is your sandwich menu. It has only a couple of items. Why don't you spread them out directly? There's enough space where the sandwich actually is for some icons. So you spare one click. And then
Right.
all the
Yeah, that could
options
be
in
done.
view.
That could be done in some cases. You know, right now it's like I don't know how many things are going to be there yet, because you know, in the inspector, you know, one of the things for that menu is the views. And we haven't implemented views yet, and I don't know how many different views the objects are going to have, and I don't know what icons I would use for them. We could do tabs. You know, there are other inspectors that use tabs. Tabs are a little bit spread out. They take a lot of horizontal space. You know that, but I agree with you that that is something that that needs to be thought about. And that is something I have thought about.
Yeah. So I like how you use vertical space, but it's difficult enough. But you should also do the horizontal space. It's always annoying.
Yeah. Well, the horizontal and the vertical layouts are the same code.
Mhm.
So the automatic sizing by content, you know, should happen. You know, and sometimes you do want more width in that left-hand column, because if you're,
Yes.
you know, if you have a large snippet of code that you want to put in an evaluator
Yeah.
that might have longer line lengths, then you need more, you know, so you, like, as you say, it's hard to guess in advance what you're going to need, but when you add columns or rows into the layout, then adjusting things based on how much is actually there is at least a first step.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
And we're not there, but that's very much, you know, something I want to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right now there's a bug that if you actually drag a splitter all the way so that you squish all of the things above or below or to the side to 0, you get a divide by 0 error.
Well, yeah.
But that one turned out to be hard enough to fix with that particular algorithm. And I knew I wanted a different algorithm anyway, that I'm just waiting until I come up with a different algorithm to fix that.
Okay, otherwise, great. I really like this IDE. It's a very fresh approach and very handy, I think. Very cool.
Thank you.
I have a question from my side. This Dusan speaking. Let me open the camera on the list. Sorry. What I've seen is that you do not, let's say, use the tools from Faro itself. So you don't, let's say, the inspector could be extended, the debugger could be extended. So what about, let's say, your tooling? Is it possible to extend it, to have own extensions to the inspector, like it is possible in the Faro and GT ones?
I think GT is more designed for being extended. You know, GT, they're really into the whole moldable thing, which is good, but I haven't been thinking about it as much as to how to do that. That is something that might be something to explore in the future, though. I do want to look, you know, we looked at the Glamorous Toolkit work when we started this project in 2020, and we were thinking about, you know, well, should we use that? Should we use the native Spec2 code in Faro 9? What should we use for the GUI? And at that time, the GT stuff wasn't really ready for use. It was still in alpha at that point. But going forward, I think that the Fink guys have some pretty good ideas. I'd like to go on a, you know, pull what ideas we can from them, also possibly use some code. As Faro is working on and intending to eventually move to using the block graphical infrastructure instead of Morphic. And so at some point, Sparkle would probably change to use that, and then more actual integration with GT stuff would be possible.
I mean, the whole idea of Spec2 is primarily that you have different backends, and at the moment you have not only the Morphic backend, but you also have the GTK backend.
Yes.
And let's say some primary things had been rewritten, like the playground and other tooling is now converted to Spec2.
Right.
And let's say if it could be reused, and it's totally different from what GT did, because in GT you ended up with a lot of extensions. And this is like the thing tooling is looking like. You had lots of extensions on the direct classes then, but let's say you end up basically with methods. In Spec 2, how Faro uses it now, and what is now the future of how the tooling is going, the new tools that Faro now includes in Faro 9 and 10, you have, let's say, all the presenters in separate classes, and you could completely reuse them. So if you need a list, if you need a tree, if you need something that has, let's say, two trees connected or other, you could reuse them. And this is much easier even than in GT. And I wonder how far you have tried this with the let's say, still kind of re-implementation based on Spec 2.
Right. The Sparkle is using an extended version of Spec 2. I mean, Spec 2 was still in development when we started. I may be misunderstanding some of what Spec 2 does. Some things Spec 2 just didn't implement yet. And some of the things that I'm doing, I'm not sure GTK could even do, but certainly I wouldn't expect that to work the way it is right now. So really, we're only doing it on the back end. A customer, our customer that kind of prompted us to do this said they were using Spec 2 and had tried it out, and even though it was very early days for Spec 2, and that they liked it. I kind of like Spec 2's general organization of presenters and then and then an adapter to the back end. But Sparkle has, well, there's a package inside of Sparkle called Spextensions, which are extensions to Spec 2 and to Morphic. So there's a bunch of new presenters and new adapters and new Morphic classes. I couldn't get stuff to align in Morphic the way I wanted it to. The Morphic table morph or table layout is just kind of crazy. So I replaced it entirely in the stuff that I'm doing. I think that I don't think I've done any extensions to base classes at all. I think I only subclass and then use subclasses at this point in Sparkle.
A nice thing on using GTK is also that you could mix it up with Morphic. So all the parts that you possibly do not use from GTK, you can have in Morphic. So for instance, the horizontal visualizations, you can have all of them also too, if you run on that one. So there are nice demos available already. I can put a video into the chat, which was shared this week for FOSDEM by the team who did that from Esteban's side and other.
Okay.
At least as someone, let's say, who then uses Faro and let's say has a collision between how Faro looks like and how then let's say your tooling looks like. Let's say it's not aligned then, because you have different UI and other. So it would be better to, let's say, bring it together like in an Eclipse to have a similar user experience, and not have a break in how you work either on the Faro side or on the GemStone side.
This sounds like something that could be tackled in a camp Smalltalk, or at least discussed, right?
Yes.
So potentially, Marty, start booking tickets for Europe for the summer.
If I go to Europe this year, it's probably going to be to Novi Sad for ISAG.
Yeah, exactly. Arrive there on the Saturday, so you can hack a little bit on other camp Smalltalk.
Yep, that would be good. Let's hope it can happen this time. Third try, like they say.
Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah, across the ocean is more complicated, but you can still, especially in the summer, it's doable to travel in Europe these days. Anyway, any more questions?
About Morphic, I could do a quick demo to show you how your collect example would look like in Self from 1995. If there's any interest, it'll only take a few seconds.
Oh, yeah, that sounds fun.
Let's see if, can I share my screen?
Bottom green, you saw?
Huh?
Bottom green button. Bottom row.
Yeah.
I'm seeing his screen.
Yep.
Looks like Self.
Yep. Go ahead.
Okay, so it's a collection array with the elements 1, 2, 3. So this is what we call the outliner. It's the equivalent of the inspector. It has an evaluator, so you can create an object here, which 5, 10, 15. So in your example, I don't know if there's a better way of doing this. I'll just put a hold in it. And so this is the debugger. Sorry about the color. So here you can see the method. I'm in the stop. And I'm going to do a next. I'm going to step into this. So now we have multiple levels. I'm going to do next. I'm going to step into that. And for every, so you can, we don't have the step buttons. It's only for the whole stack frame. So you can see the multiple methods, and then for each level, you can see what self is. You can see what the block is. So you can inspect the different variables, and you can see them all at the same time. You just can't step through the different levels.
So, so the stepping levels, the stepping always happens in the whatever is top there, the top frame.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Let me just check that. Yeah. So now I actually was able to crash it, I think. But I just wanted to give you the idea of the visual aspect of it.
Yeah, no, that's good to see. It's good to see. And it had even more windows because that you had to make a new window every time you wanted to inspect something out of the debugger, but seeing multiple things is good.
Yeah, now within a single debugger, within a single inspector, you can look at multiple methods at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But only within a single object. If you want to look at stuff, then you end up with a ton of little windows.
Right.
But they are created automatically. You don't have to open new windows. You just click and you immediately get a new window.
Yeah, you get more than you want sometimes. But what I wanted to show you is that this was a step towards some of the people that did Newspeak, they had come from the Self project, so they were familiar with this debugger.
Right.
So
yeah.
Kind of where the history of it is.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Another addition from my side. I mean, what is really an annoyance in most, or in nearly any Smalltalk is we tend to always have this, let's say, missing support for BD, so bidirectional interfaces. So we always have that left to right reading. So we have our navigation from left to right, our labeling from left to right. But if you would like to support, let's say, areas like Arabic countries, you need to have the other way around. So you need to switch UI directly. And if you look at, let's say, Eclipse or others, they do this. Or if you look at Bootstrap framework, which is very often used for UIs also in web and other, and they have not only the normal package, but they have a BD package. So could have the UI differently. And Smalltalk never really tackled that. At least I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I haven't seen that either. The other thing that would be nice to go both ways is debugger stepping. It would be lovely to be able to step backwards. And Jan Vrani demoed that a few years ago at a couple of conferences, that he'd done that for Smalltalk X. And he had a debugger that would step backwards, which was quite interesting. But
we have a slight approximation in that you can go one frame up and then restart that frame and then step a little bit before where you were before. That sometimes will almost do the job of stepping backwards.
Yes, but if you, and you could make a user interface that makes that easier than doing it manually, and that is often how it's done. But yeah, there's the RR, the record and replay framework, and he was leveraging that to be able to reverse the state of the image, I guess. So that's that's a maybe someday kind of thing. Not high on the list, but always nice to have when you've made one step too far. And
okay,
that's another thing where jump to could go, because you could jump to backwards as well, if you like.
Just automatically save the image every time you press a button.
Effectively, yeah. I mean, that's, if I understand it correctly, that's pretty much what RR does.
I have another question, Martin. Do you factor in mobile devices into your design layout? And would it even make sense to have a debugger on a mobile?
Well, the mobile device that I want, it would make perfect sense.
Yeah.
Not the mobile device that I have. Because the mobile device that I want has a screen that is, this big, but I can wad it up into a little ball and stuff it into my pocket. Okay. They're working on that, right? I mean, we've got TVs that roll up now, right? And we have phones that fold in half some of the time.
Projectors.
Yeah, right. I always wanted to project my pocket, but so so if you had a big enough screen, I think it would make a lot of sense. And that's one of the reasons, it's one of the reasons that I'm designing the Sparkle user interface to be touch friendly with the, with the hamburger menus and all, partly because, some people, and you can get, 24-inch, you can get a 24-inch touch monitor fairly inexpensively, and I don't know how many people are using them, but I want it to work well for that. And also the other reason is that those people are used to those kinds of interfaces now. Yeah. So I wanted to use things that are not just familiar to Smalltalk people, but are familiar to people that use modern user interfaces. So I hope that we do get better mobile devices in the future, and that could work,
Also, we have mobile devices now where through gestures you can zoom fairly easily. So I wonder if that could play into things. And also, I wonder if everything needs to be the same size all the time. If there's any potential for fisheye lens style interfaces where parts of the UI are bigger and some are smaller.
Yeah, where you focus on something. Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea.
And there's 3D as well.
Right, yeah.
For a mobile device, you could also use the accelerometer to, as you move it around, you'd see different parts of the GUI. Although that's sort of like if you have a vision problem and you're trying to read stuff with a magnifier glass, where you can only see a very, very tiny little thing. It's really annoying, but it might get the job done if you just move your phone around and see different parts of the GUI.
Martin, there is actually a foldable laptop from Asus. You can't put it in your pocket, but we are getting there. It opens up, it becomes a tablet is twice the size of a standard laptop.
Nice. That's a start. That's a start.
Yeah. Well,
And
I used to just carry around a full tooth Bluetooth keyboard in my pocket. I have big pockets because just trying to actually type on the phone or even an iPad mini was just far too irritating.
Yeah. It's a little better now, but yeah, I do keep this little flat blue. This was part of a case that came with a used tablet that I got, but it's a nice little general purpose Bluetooth keyboard. And when I'm at home, that's what I use if I have to text with people.
Yeah, and the other side is, of course, dealing with working at home and having a big screen. And I'm trying to convince my wife that an 8K display is a sensible device.
Yeah, I have a 4K. I was only sharing about a quarter of my screen with you because it's a 42-inch 4K monitor.
Yes, that's great. Yeah, I have something
I have two 4K monitors, each 2 meters wide and 1.5 meters high, and I'm sitting at this distance from it. That is the most amazing thing I ever said. So it's wider than my field of view. I have to swivel to see everything.
It's kind of a built
and it only cost me. It only cost $800. I mean, this is really cheap.
Yeah.
My eyes suck, and so I've found that size is much more important than resolution. And I'll often just take a cheap 1080 flat panel TV and plop it on the desk. It works much better. I'll even work sometimes off of the projector, so like a 9 to 12 foot diagonal.
Sorry to interrupt, but you know, since we kind of veering off topic, as someone made me notice, there are more questions from Martin related to Sparkle, not related to his desired laptop. All right, so if there are
one question, I have one question. Okay. Why is GemStone 3.7 needed, except the process scheduling, which has changed? Why is this?
There's process for RSR, there's process scheduling changes and some changes to the ephemeron handling. Ephemerons, which it uses fairly heavily. I think those are the only ones that I know of. There may be some changes to socket handling as well, but I know that
asynchronous notifications.
Right.
That would be the other change.
Right. Thanks, Kurt. So you do need those things for Sparkle. For the debugger, then you need it uses API for stepping and such that didn't exist in previous versions.